Okay, we may have a few more people log on, but we're going to go ahead and get started since it's 4 o'clock. I'd like to welcome everyone to the National Ocean Sciences Bowl Professional Development Webinar Series. My name is Melissa, and I work in the National NOSB office in Washington, D.C. Thanks for letting me know that everybody could hear us loud and clear. We have today both NOSB coaches and other educators who are interested in ocean science on the line. So just for those of you who may not know anything about NOSB, we are an academic competition for high school students, and those students are getting tested in their knowledge of everything related to oceans and ocean science. And these students are extremely smart, and they get tested more at a introductory college level than a typical high school level. So again, these kids are amazing to watch in competition. But we hold these webinar series specifically for our coaches. The coaches are spending a lot of time preparing their students for the competitions, and we want to make sure that they have the knowledge about ocean sciences so that they can infuse things that they've learned into their classrooms and their practices. And for the past few years, we've had a theme for each competition year, and this year our theme is the science of oil in the ocean. So these webinars really help coaches and other educators learn about some of the current research going on in that topic and some of just the basic information that you may not get from a textbook or other places where you go to study. So today we have our first webinar, but we will have two more. So you can go to the nosb.org website, and under our Learn category, we have listed all the information you need to know about the webinar series. We will also have information about this shortly on our front page on the website. Each of these webinars is going to be an hour-long presentation by an expert, and then we'll give you an opportunity for about 30 minutes to do question and answer. So all of you seem to know where that chat box is now. So throughout the presentation, and especially at the end, simply type in your questions, and I will read them to our presenter so that he can answer. As I said earlier, we're going to keep all the attendees on mute just to ensure that everybody can hear the presenter and that there's no feedback or weird noises in the background. So if for some reason you become unmuted, I will mute you again, don't worry. Also feel free to provide feedback in that chat area at the very end of the webinar about something that you liked or something new that you learned. It really helps us in retaining funding for the program and this series when we know how these webinars really help our coaches and other educators. So today our guest is Dr. Christopher Reddy, and he's from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and he's kicking off this webinar series on the science of oil in the ocean, talking a bit about the origins of oil in the ocean, because we know it's not just from oil spills, it's also naturally made, and talking about the composition of that oil, as he says in his slide, on a molecular basis, and how that really helps researchers determine what's going on with oil in the ocean. So I'm going to turn this over to Chris so that he can start his presentation.
Okay, well, can everybody hear me fine? So Melissa here from Melissa, otherwise I'm just going to jump right in. So thank you for attending my presentation, and what I'm going to try to take home for you today is that all oil spills are different, and that oil changes once it's released into the environment. And in fact, the title slide actually has 4 panels, and the top left one is, they're all from the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The top left one is the oil that's coming out of the bottom of the seafloor at the Macondo well. The second one over from the left is oil that is from this well that was about a mile away on the sea surface, so it's traveled up 5,000 feet and moved over on the surface about a mile. And then the third panel is several hundred miles away, oil that was that hit some grasses. What's interesting about that picture is if you went back a week later, there wasn't any oil on there, so it actually washed away. And the last picture on the right-hand side is some oil that we scraped off some rocks in Alabama about 3 years after the spill, and they all come from the Macondo Deepwater Horizon disaster. And so even not only their oil spills different, but looks and behaves changes with time. So I have a couple take-home messages that I hope that will resonate and capture today. The first is that all oils are not the same. That when oil gets released into the environment, its impacts and how it's acted upon are really based on the molecules that compose the oil. The molecules are the idea is that when I think of an oil spill, I don't think of it as one big black liquid. I think of it as a large extended family of molecules, all with different personalities and different behaviors and different wants and needs and levels of toughness in that respect. The other thing that you want to take home is that because all these different chemical compounds have different personalities, they actually change quite differently once they're released into the environment. They're released by different processes, and different compounds have different affinities for changes. And these changes that are usually collectively called weathering. You know, a lot of aspects of oil spills is like buying a house. It's location, location, location. There are other aspects in terms of what type of oil gets spilled, but collectively, how an oil behaves, its fate, and its impacts also relate to where it's been released. And, you know, as much as the Deepwater Horizon, which occurred in April of 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, is very much involved in this presentation and on the minds of your students, it is quite likely that the next spill may not be a Deepwater Horizon. And in fact, the next spill of some significance in the Gulf of Mexico was in Galveston Bay in Texas in March of 2014. It wasn't as large, but on a kind of a gallon per gallon basis, it actually had a significant impact. You know, the other thing that you want to think about it, I'm very much a chemist. I think about oil spills and nature, and I don't really know much about toxicology, and I really wouldn't know the difference between a pelican and another bird, honestly. But I think about an oil spill as a slap in the face to nature. And how does nature fight back? You know, we are essentially putting nature on a treadmill when we release oil or any other type of human-induced activity. That could even include increased amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You know, we're all watching how nature responds. So my outline today is to talk a little bit about oil as formed, a little bit about how oil, the composition of oil, a little bit of background about oil spills in general, some aspects of how oil is affected or weathered in the environment, and some summary. Clearly this could be maybe a 1 or a 2 semester long class, so I kind of picked and chose, and hopefully I strike a good balance. You can get my email if you have any questions. You can follow up and I can try to help you out as best as I can. So the first thing I want to talk about is how is oil formed? And you know, the way that, you know, we think about it kind of in a somewhat slang manner is that it's essentially the old algal debris that lived in the sea surface ocean hundreds of millions of years ago. And some aspect of that algae and other material was deposited on the seafloor, and that material was reworked and worked on by microbes and other reactions and created a geopolymer, which we call kerogen. And that kerogen gets buried deeper and deeper due to materials growing on top, being delivered on top of it. And the end result is that this kind of organic rich kerogen, once the temperature and the pressure get hot and high enough, you can think of that material getting cut apart with a pair of scissors. And so you're breaking apart this geopolymer into smaller molecules. And those smaller molecules are oil. And we call this cooking and squeezing. And at some point, if you keep cooking and squeezing and let's say cutting apart the molecules, the end result is you end up getting gas, or just mainly methane. So, and depending on how old and different processes, you can have oil and gas or mixtures of oil and gas. Crude oil can differ substantially by a lot of variables that you can even take home from this slide. It can depend on the type of plant debris that was deposited. It can depend on what depth it was buried. It can depend on the temperatures and the pressures and how old it's been sitting there. And in fact, sometimes some microbes can get inside of a reservoir and actually eat some of the oil. And so the end result is that even crude oil is different. So crude oil that's taken off the coast of California is significantly different than crude oil from the Gulf of Mexico. So in terms of, this is just a picture of the next slide here. This is just a picture of kind of an idea of that when we drill for oil, in this case, this is kind of representative of the Deepwater Horizon. You can recover oil and gas in a permeable rock that's buried, that's covered by an impermeable rock that allows the oil and gas to be trapped, and we can recover. In this case, the reservoir was 18,000 feet below the bottom of the ocean floor. And so when and on the right-hand side, I want to just give you an idea that material that was flowing out of the base of the ocean floor that you saw on CNN was actually a mixture of oil and gas. And I have the breakdown here in terms of whether or not, in terms of moles versus mass, and that relates to the molecular weight of the gases being smaller than the molecular weight of some of the compounds that make up the oil, like decane, which has 10 atoms in it. One thing to note about the Deepwater Horizon is that as much as the attention was on the oil that was released from the environment, as you can see in terms of moles or even in mass, there was a significant amount of natural gas. It was mainly methane that was released that you don't really hear much about. So the Deepwater Horizon was not just an oil spill, it was an oil and gas release. When I think about oil, again, as I mentioned before, as a cast of characters, of different organic compounds that make up the oil. And depending on where the oil came from and how long it's been cooked and squeezed and other processes, you can get a vast distribution of compounds that make up the oil. And here, in a rather simple manner, we've broken it down into basically three classes. You have saturated hydrocarbons, you have aromatic hydrocarbons, and then what we call collectively polar compounds. And in this drop right here, we want to think about compounds that mainly were made when the oil was cooked and squeezed and broken into pieces. And you can make many, many different compounds. In fact, that process that when the oil that kerogen gets broken up to pieces is called catagenesis. And catagenesis can create thousands of different compounds from that geopolymer called kerogen. In this case, in the bottom right-hand corner, I have just a brief overview that the vast majority of the oil, not the gas, but just the oil that flew out of the Macondo well was saturated hydrocarbons with some aromatics in this polars, which I'll explain in the next couple slides. Forgive me, somehow or another, I just crashed my computer and this really nice slide I had here disappeared, but this is kind of a little bit more on a structural basis of different types of compounds that are in oil, whether they're alkanes and straight alkanes, where all the atoms are connected in a row, or together, or we can have branched compounds, we can have cyclic compounds, and we can have aromatic compounds. The key point is that you have a vast majority of compounds, and I'm going to just drive this home. The relative abundance of some of these compounds and these compounds in the next all can differ depending on a variety of different processes. That's even within a crude oil. We're not even talking about when crude oil gets distilled and refined and makes products like gasoline and diesel fuel. Then the composition can change differently. Again, all these different molecules can make up oil. They all have different personalities, and the composition can vary significantly from oil to oil. This is just a slide. Often, many folks are concerned about a relatively small fraction of compounds that are in oil called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. If you're really excited as a scientist, it kind of sounds like PHs. And these are some of the compounds that people worry about. It's interesting that these compounds get so much attention because they only make up a very small fraction of the total amount of oil. And that has to do with the way in which what we know about toxicity. There's likely many, many more compounds in the oil that have other impacts, but we just haven't studied them that well. So despite all the great science that we can do and we're doing, especially with the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative that's been on for now three and a half years and doing a lot of work on oil spills, we still have a lot of work to go. We're making great strides, but more work to do. Of course, I sound like a scientist. All scientists always say there's more work to do. I want to talk to you about just one more of these asphaltenes and resins. These are kind of like the lost souls of oil spills. They're the pieces, the kind of pieces of the polymer that didn't get cut and even into smaller pieces. You can think about it like that. And they're in some oils, a lot of the oil is made up of asphaltenes and resins. And I'm not going to get into the difference between them. The key point is these are much larger molecules, and we really don't know much about how they behave in the environment. And that's certainly one aspect of research that's been ongoing very rigorously in the last couple of years. So they're overlooked, and even in the Deepwater Horizon oil, the Macondo oil, which does not have much of these compounds, it's still a lot. When you release 200 million gallons of oil and 10% of them are these compounds, it's still a significant load. I left perhaps the most interesting aspect of the compounds that are in oil last, and they're called biomarkers. Sometimes they're called molecular fossils. Now, some compounds that were in the original organic matter that got deposited on the seafloor, like some of the phytoplankton and some of the, they make compounds like steranes, like a sterol, or cholesterol. And some of these molecules start out as something like other compounds that are in the species that get deposited on the seafloor. But with time, they actually don't get beat up by the cooking and squeezing. They just get slightly modified. And so in my next slide, I'm going to try to show you an example. On the left-hand panel, this is a compound that's what we call a hopanoid on the left-hand side, and it was present in some of these species that were falling on the bottom of the ocean floor. Now, when we come back hundreds of millions of years later, we can see a compound that's kind of similar to it. And that compound is hopane, which is a really valuable compound in oil spill science. It acts like, just like I said, a molecular fossil. It helps you identify and give you some insight as to the genetic code of the oil, because that molecule on your left-hand side was specific to certain species that got deposited on the sea floor. So you can think about maybe on the left-hand side as like an intact bone from a dinosaur. And then on the right-hand side, you can say that you went on some type of excavation, and you found a bone from, T-Rex that had a couple breaks in it. But, nevertheless, the skeleton, the big pieces were there enough for you to infer back what was there before. And that's kind of what we do. And surprisingly, these molecules are really environmentally tough. And so that makes them powerful because they contain the genetic code of an oil. And that's a big aspect of what we call fingerprinting oil, which is always on the mind of a lot of people trying to figure out where an oil came from and whether or not one oil came from one tanker versus another. We call that fingerprint. So just want to remind you again, so there's crude oil, lots of different types of crude oils depending on where it's made in the around the world. It can differ in its molecular composition depending on the temperatures and pressures and the organic matter that got deposited on the seafloor and the types of microbes and other reactions that occurred as it got buried. And at some point, that crude oil gets recovered, gets brought up, and then gets brought to a refinery. And the refineries take the crude oil and fractionate it into different aspects of what we would call roughly a distillates. And these distillates have different amounts of carbon atoms in them, and have different uses. And so you can see in this kind of relative distillation column that compounds like that are in gasoline with a little blue car, they are a distillate from crude oil that usually has about 5 to 10 carbon atoms in the molecules that compose it. And you can compare that to something like lubricating oil, which is has a lower boiling point, a higher boiling point, and takes a little bit more effort to distill off a column. And that has a lot more carbon atoms. So the oil that goes in the crankcase of your car and then actually eventually leaks out into the road has many more carbon atoms in it. And you can kind of look through from gasoline to jet fuel to diesel to lubricating oil to what we call fuel oils, and even the residue which is used in making roads. Now you can see that that they all have a different range of carbon atoms in the molecules that make them up. So clearly, not only can you have different crude oils that make up, that go to the refinery, but when you refine and you make different products, those products have different chemical compositions in them. So a gasoline is a gasoline because it has, about 5 to 10 carbon atoms in them, which is much different than diesel. And then not only can you distill the oil based on its capacity to be distilled, but then the refineries actually do a little bit more. They do a variety of different reactions so that they make a gasoline, a better gasoline, or they try to convert some aspect of the crude oil that wasn't very attractive to make it a little bit more valuable. And so it's a good thing. When you study oil spills, it can be somewhat bittersweet. They sometimes can affect you hope to be there, and other times they leave behind a little bit of a clue that tells you. Sometimes it's hard to tell between a crude oil spill and an oil that's kind of similar in crude oil that came out of a refinery. Sometimes it's hard, but we can actually see sometimes the imprint of a refinery in a sample. Sometimes you can show that refineries are a particularly harsh environment and they can change a molecule that wouldn't be changed that much in a reservoir. So, just to make studying oil spills a little bit more complicated, again, you have different crude oils that have different compositions. You go to a refinery, you can refine the oil and get different fractions based on how many carbon atoms are off the distillation column. Then you can even do one step further and actually beat up on the columns and do all types of reactions on them. And the end result is that the capacity, the spectrum of compounds, oils that can be released into the environment are pretty vast. There's a variety of analytical techniques that are used to study the composition, like what compounds make up oils and which ones are the most abundant. It's typically we use the kind of workhorse for the last 3 or 4 decades is gas chromatography. It's gone under many different evolutions, but the end result is about the same. Project a rather complex mixture on a column, long, thin, narrow column, sometimes anywhere from about 20 to 60 meters long. It's about as wide as, looks like maybe a fishing line. And inside there's a column, open column, and each compound, depending on its chemical and physical properties, will travel through that column at a different speed. The time it takes to come out and then get detected, a detector is basically something that's telling you, it's kind of like the photo finish of a series of races going through this column. It can keep track of what came out at a certain time. That time is called the retention time, and that retention time is related to that molecule's personality. Usually bigger compounds take longer to come out. And in this on the top right-hand part of this cartoon, we have 3 different peaks. Those 3 peaks, in theory, represent 3 molecules. The peak on the far left is one that took the shortest amount of time to come out of the column. So it went through that long, thin column the fastest. The second compound was the second fastest, but it's also the most compared to the other 2. So from looking at a gas chromatographic chromatogram, sometimes we call them a trace, we can understand and get an idea as to the composition of all those different molecules that make up the oil. We also can tell who's the most abundant. So gas chromatography separates complex mixtures into compounds and allows them to be measured. There's a little bit more nuance about being able to identify what compound comes out at a specific retention time, but I'm not going to worry about that today. I want to be more interested in being able to show you that gas chromatograms can show you a kind of a quick inventory, a visual warehouse, teach you what your warehouse of all the different oils, all the different compounds that are in your oil. So I'm just going to show you a couple chromatograms. These are GC stands for gas chromatography, and FID stands for flame ionization detector. That simply means that when the compound's diluted out of the column, we burnt them, and as you burn them, you make some ions, and those ions are able to be detected. The more abundant compounds make more ions, and so that's how we're able to see relative amounts. And we can actually calibrate these instruments to be able to tell much more accurately how much one compound is there versus another. So I'm going to show you a series of chromatograms just to kind of get you an idea. You've been hearing me talk for a while about how compounds are different and vary. So maybe the best way is to visually show to you how different they can be. So the first chromatogram shown here is the oil that came out of the Macondo well from the Deepwater Horizon. And just to give you kind of a quick tour of these chromatograms, again, retention time is on the x-axis, and that just tells you how long a compound took to travel through the column. So the compound that came out about 11 minutes, you can see a very nice sharp peak, came out much faster than, say, the compound around 35 minutes, which is also a nice sharp peak. You also can see kind of visually that maybe the compound that came out around 11 minutes is maybe twice as tall as the compound that came at 11, which, you know, kind of in a quick way means that that compound is about twice as abundant. And you can see many different compounds, and in fact, you can see between like the signal and there's a dotted line. That dotted line, that all that material is many compounds that all travel at the same time through the column, and we actually can't even resolve them. So that it just means there's many compounds that we can't see, that we can't separate and identify. On the x-axis, we also plot what we call the N-alkane carbon number. Now, N means normal, and so a normal compound of 17 means 7 carbon atoms attached in a row. And we convert and are able to identify where the compound that has 17 carbon atoms is present versus, for example, 5 or the 30 or 35 and 40. And we use this kind of system of being able, it really helps us get a handle on what types of compounds are present in the oil. Retention time can vary depending on what type of gas chromatograph you have in your lab or even in different types of columns. So it's much more user-friendly and comparable across other labs and other studies by comparing where the compounds move relative to compounds that, let's say, in this case, have 12 carbon atoms in a row versus 40 carbon atoms in a row. You can see from the Macondo well oil, it has compounds that range from, let's say, 10 carbon atoms present all the way up to even 50. So it's a very wide range, and that's because it's a crude oil. Crude oils have a vast range of compounds present. Let's compare a crude oil versus a distillate. So again, just as a quick, this is the oil that came from the Deepwater Horizon. Light means that it's a crude oil that has a lot of smaller compounds, so compounds that have smaller carbon atoms and lower viscosity. We can get into that a little bit later if we have time. Sweet just means that it doesn't have much sulfur in it. There's potential for, during that process of of oil formation that sulfur can get incorporated into the organic matter, and you can make sulfur-rich compounds and have other sulfur compounds, sulfur materials in there, and that sulfur sours the oil. And so a light sweet crude is a crude oil that has a lot of smaller, in general compounds, and it doesn't have much sulfur present in it. This is a diesel fuel that we bought from a gas station down the street from my house. And you can see the diesel is a little bit much more different. And I'm going to toggle, and hopefully don't make you dizzy, between the Macondo oil and the diesel. And what that just shows you is that if you can think about that Macondo oil went through a distillation column and got fractionated, you can see that what was collected from about 10 to about 25 carbons was the diesel, what we call the diesel cut. And again, you can see, in this case, you can see a variety of molecules present in the oil. Just by the way, you see a little red asterisk in each one of those samples, each one of these chromatograms, and that's just a compound that we add for our analysis. That's just in there for a reference sake. I'm going to show you a few more chromatograms from different oil spills that have happened in the past 10 years. So this is an oil, a fuel oil. They call it a fuel oil. It's a rather interesting oil. It's oil that went to the refinery. It wasn't very good, and it got refined, and then it got cracked, and then they made a mixture of it, and it's often used for vessels and for power supplies. And this is the Bouchard 120 cargo. And this was an oil that was released in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts in 2003. So we call these a fuel oil. Now this is the Costco Busan, which was a vessel that was leaving Oakland, California, about to cross the Pacific Ocean. And as it was traveling, this was the fuel that it was using to actually power the vessel. And it accidentally clipped the Bay Bridge. And this tank, it's number 4 tank that had on this vessel, released some oil from into the environment. And it was only a 58,000 gallon spill in 2007, but surprisingly it's had some impacts. It affected the herring population and other aspects as well. Again, you can see, just for a comparison, the Costco Busan Tank 4 oil was also called a fuel oil, and here's the Bouchard 120. Well, they are similar, they're different enough, and that difference, again, is just to remind you that even a fuel oil, these are fuel oils that, again, used to power vessels and also for heating, they can have different compositions. This story about differences gets even more interesting for the Costco Busan. This is a cargo vessel, again, that was leaving Oakland, California, traveling across the Pacific. The tank number 4 clipped and hit the Bay Bridge and released some oil. And initially, it was thought that tank 3 also released oil, was ruptured. And the Coast Guard was able to collect a sample of tank 3, and we analyzed that. So this is tank number 3 and tank number 4 on a boat in November of 2007 that hit the Bay Bridge. Look at the difference. Sorry about that little blue square, but here's the remarkableness. This is a vessel that has 2 different fuel oils in it used to power it underway in 2 different tanks. And we did some fingerprinting that I can't talk about, but what we ended up finding out was that despite thoughts that tank 3 might have been released some oil, it didn't. And the end result was that we were able to show with some field studies that the oil that was around San Francisco Bay and actually even outside of the Golden Gate Bridge was all from tank 4 and not tank 3. But, this just underscores the complexity of oil spill studies as well, is that even in barges, for example, I studied an oil spill in 1996 that was carrying home heating oil and diesel fuel, which are the same aspect. They too had the holds had different oils in them. So when you have a vessel that has an accident and releases oil, it's quite possible that the tanks containing the oil may have 2 different oils in them, or more than 2. This is another fuel oil that was released in November of 2002 off the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal from the vessel called the Prestige. And this is also a fuel oil. Oh, sorry. Oh, boy. Go back. Oh, no. Hang in there. All right. Hang in there. Oh, boy. Hang in there. All right. We're back in business. No, we're not. Hang in there. I got to shut off this foolish slideshow thing. All right. Hey, Melissa, are we cool now?
Yes, I can see all your slides.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. So this is the Prestige oil. And then the last is another oil that was containing another fuel oil that spilled in Texas, in Galveston Bay. Now you might be asking yourself, I just showed you a bunch of slides for what they call fuel oil, which is this mixture of oil that's made at the refinery after it's been distilled. The reason why I showed you mostly chromatograms of fuel oils is because they're the most oil spills in the last decade, with the exception of Deepwater Horizon, have actually been from fuel oils, oils that are used to either power vessels or some heating, some home heating, but often also either as a fuel itself being brought someplace or actually in the vessel itself. And so the last 10 or so years, many of the high-profile oil spills, with the exception of Deepwater Horizon, were not crude oils, they weren't diesels, they were these mixtures called fuel oils. Here's one more last chromatogram. This is an interesting chromatogram. We were out trying to study the Kirby Spill, and that was the spill that happened in March of 2014 in the previous slide. We collected some oil off some rocks in Galveston Bay, and then there was some other oil, some black splotches that we scraped off and we brought back to the lab and we analyzed it, and this is what we got. It is significantly different. Now, believe it or not, very close to this spill. We collected actually many more samples that look like this, which clearly are very, very different than what was released. So this is really an example of that you can have other sources of oil that have already exist before a spill. So you have areas where there's a lot of activity, for example, in Galveston, the Galveston area where there actually, in this field study, we ended up finding 7 different types of oils along the Texas coastline near where we were trying to study the Kirby Spill. And we ended up figuring out that this was a coal tar type creosote that was likely used to waterproof pilings and other, like railroad ties or for parts of docks, D-O-C-K-S. Sorry, it's my Rhode Island accent. So I hope that you have this take home that, these chromatograms give you some insight as to what makes up oil, and that different oils have different compositions. And if that's if you can go back and tell your students that all oils aren't the same, that their chemical composition can differ, that many of the oils that have occurred, many of the oil spills that have occurred in the last 10 years have not been Deepwater Horizon, that's a pretty good victory. I just want to give you a little bit of an oil spill 101 next. You know, this is a figure made by my colleague John Farrington and I can't remember my other friend's name, but nevertheless, this is gives you kind of a snapshot. Judy McDowell. This gives you an idea as to the inputs of oil to the coastal environment. This is before Deepwater Horizon, which would certainly skew this. But I want you to see a couple numbers to take home. I think the biggest number is that natural oil seeps release about 50% of the oil to the environment. The other number that's kind of interesting is the 10% that runs off. And that 10% is mainly what we call the leaky faucet of urban runoff. And that's when your cars leak, some of the oil leaves that kind of shiny black line in the middle of the highway, and when it rains, it runs off into the environment. And then you have an oil spill. And so you can think about not only what percentage of oil that's getting released, but you also have to think about where it's getting impacted, whether or not you have, and how fast the rate is. So you might have urban runoff. That's a leaky faucet. It's probably running off in a very urban area where it's already previously oiled, is oiled all the time with trace amounts of used motor oil. And that'd be very different than perhaps a very pristine location that was overrun by, let's say, a diesel fuel spill, which is very different than the oil that's seeping out naturally from the bottom of the ocean floor. But the interesting about natural seeps, and we'll talk about it later, is they only occur in certain locations around the world. And they, too, are also a leaky faucet. Oil comes out every day. And also, the composition of the natural oil seeps is different than perhaps the oil that comes from an accidental spill, and definitely different than the oil that's put in your car that you get from Jiffy Lube. So, you know, I've been thinking about oil spills for about 20 years, and I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures from different spills I work on. And as much as I always think that I have a pretty good handle about what happens in oil spills, I got to tell you that, you know, this previous experience and knowledge really just helps me when I work on the next spill, just as a very kind of quick, you know, basic experiences. You know, being able to predict what happens in another oil spill is a huge challenge because nature is in different states, at different locations, and different types of oil, and sometimes it takes a while to even get an analysis of the oil before you can start making some predictions. So overall, it's a lot of challenges. I have to tell you, though, studying oil spills, as much as it's unfortunate that they occur, it's a really exciting aspect to study, and it's very rewarding when you can make a contribution. The other aspect, in terms for you and your aspect, from your perspective, is that you know, oil spills are unfortunate, but they do grasp a lot of high school students and undergraduates and get them thinking about science. And so, you know, perhaps another silver lining is that perhaps it entrains young students into the sciences, and maybe they get entrained in sciences due to oil spills, but maybe end up doing other things. So that's another opportunity for us to use to encourage and entrain. So these are a few more slides of different oil spills that I've worked on. And again, as much as I work on them all the time, I would still say I'm very much a novice. So during the Deepwater Horizon, there was a lot of discussion about natural oil seeps in the Gulf of Mexico and Deepwater Horizon. And so I put a couple slides together that maybe provide a little bit of clarity about natural oil seeps versus the Deepwater Horizon. So in the Gulf of Mexico is a place, one of these locations in the earth where there are natural oil seeps. And natural oil seeps are, if you can think about that, like that slide a few back where you have a reservoir at the bottom, you know, in this case it was, you know, 18,000 feet below. If you had the overlying material that was over that reservoir had a crack in it. You could think about that some of this oil can permeate and kind of travel up this and percolate up to the bottom of the ocean floor. And that's basically a seep. A seep is essentially a crack in the reservoir that allows some of the oil to make a long, tortuous path, kind of running the gauntlet from an oil reservoir to the bottom of the ocean floor. And then the oil can even float up to the surface. And the end result is that you can have an oil spill every day. They happen in the Gulf of Mexico, also off the coast of California. Off the coast of California, I'm going to show you some slides next. The Chumash Indians used to waterproof their canoes with the oil, so it's thousands of years ago. And they're very much part of the ecosystem. And you have to remember, we use oil as a source of energy because it has calories in it. It's a calorie-rich material. And so if you're a microbe and you're looking to make a living and you need some energy, you can think about oil as kind of like butter. It's a really high-calorie mixture. I mean, and that's why our cars run and you get a lot of energy. If you don't get as much bang for your buck if you were trying to run a sugary water. It'd actually be a lot of work, but kind of in a pound-for-pound basis. This is just a snapshot in the Gulf of Mexico of some of the reported seeps where oil is leaking from the bottom of the ocean floor and traveling, below the ocean floor and traveling up to the surface, eventually to the surface. And some of this can be oil and gas. The Gulf of Mexico is a little bit more complicated. Its water's a lot deeper, and so I'm going to show you some examples from some natural oil seeps off the coast of California. They're within about a mile from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And if anybody has walked along the California coastlines here, you can have oil on your feet, and that's all from natural oil seeps. And my good friend and colleague, Dave Valentine, is at UC Santa Barbara and has done some really great work studying these oil seeps. And in fact, a lot of the work that I studied in the Deepwater Horizon, in many respects, was the opportunity to study oil seeps here. Because a natural oil seep is an oil spill every day. It allows you to plan accordingly about how you're going to collect samples and study them. And so it's a good thing when we can take advantage of oil seeps to be able to, perhaps practice. And that really happened. A lot of good work from many different scientists involved in the Deepwater Horizon. If you ask them, what made some of their work successful, they would say, well, I was studying natural oil and natural gas seeps. And so this is a cartoon that I put together about the seeps off the coast of California and kind of an idea as to kind of the life cycle of off of California, the natural seeps. It's a lot different off the Gulf of Mexico, but I wanted to give you an idea. The one thing I wanted to take home is on the bottom left hand of this cartoon. You can see that oil kind of going up the surface and reaching the bottom of the ocean floor. One thing you have to remember is that oil that is traveling up to the bottom of the ocean floor is under siege, for example, by microbes that might be eating some of that. And so the oil that is leaving that reservoir and then eventually hits the bottom of the ocean floor can be chemically different. So think about it like this. Let's make believe there was a drilling rig that was tapping oil from that very reservoir, but it was also leaking oil from a natural seep. If you analyzed it chemically, it would be different because the oil that was recovered by a drilling platform would not be worked upon by nature as it came up through a nice secure pipe, as opposed to the tortuous long path running the microbial gauntlet up into the bottom of the ocean floor. So I want to show you two videos of a natural oil seep in the Deepwater Horizon. So this is my friend Dave Valentine collecting a sample of oil in the bottom of the ocean floor while he's scuba diving. So this is a natural oil seep. That little black dot, I hope you can hear me over my voice. those bubbles are the bubbles the sound made by the gas that's being released. So there is natural gas that's being released from on the bottom of the ocean floor from a natural reservoir. And then there's some of that oil. And Dave wants to analyze that, actually collect it so I can analyze it. And he's having trouble. It doesn't want to drop out. So he's trying to hit it a little so he can catch it with a vial. But you got to give the guy credit. He's trying to take this video, still swim, and get this oil droplet. And he actually collected this oil droplet, and I've analyzed it. The other thing you can notice is that white filamentous material, and that is actually a bacteria that lives near these natural oil seeps that have evolved to make a living. And so this, like I said in the slide before, it's an ecosystem. So that is what we might call a leaky faucet. But that happens every day, day in, day out. Now here's a video that I was involved with for studying the Deepwater Horizon. In the middle, that's a robotic arm that we use to collect a sample of oil. And so it's holding this kind of funky looking sampler with a little metal snorkel. And I was on a boat above the ocean surface directing this remotely operated vehicle, this underwater robot, to collect a sample of the oil that was coming out of that damaged well. So you can see this is a high-def photo. But you know, here's the difference, right? People are talking about natural seeps, and you see that little droplet, and Dave's over there trying to coax that droplet to come out. And here's the difference. You have this, you know, this bubbling jet of oil that's ongoing. And, you know, kind of give you an idea of the differences between a natural seep and a disaster like from when the Macondo well had failed. I just put together just a quick table about comparing natural seeps in the Gulf of Mexico. You know, in terms of duration, they've been happening for thousands of years every day. The Deepwater Horizon occurred for 87 days in 2010. You have many, many oil seeps in the Gulf of Mexico that are natural. The Deepwater Horizon had one well 50 miles offshore. Collectively, all those leaky faucets releases about 200,000 gallons a day versus the 55,000 gallons a day from the Deepwater Horizon. I kind of touched upon this earlier, but natural oil seeps are actually a little less potent because the microbes eat some of the oil. And so it's a weathered crude. We're going to talk about that in a couple minutes. Certainly the cause of natural seeps is natural. There is some evidence that drilling affects the flow off the coast of California, but let's just say collectively it's natural. Certainly the Deepwater Horizon was a catastrophe. You know, the ecosystem has certainly evolved to handle these natural seeps. Certainly the ecosystem has also handled the Deepwater Horizon, but certainly was overwhelmed. It's hard to get some damages on what natural seeps do, but we certainly know there were damages from the Deepwater Horizon. So hopefully, you know, you get a feeling that, you know, don't overlook those little droplets that come from natural seeps. You know, the leaky faucet can give you a big water bill at the end of the year. But it's also different oil. And if I showed you chromatograms of these two different oils, they would be vastly different. Even though, you know, in reality, a Gulf of Mexico crude can be kind of similar. Just to give you another feeling about the history of oil spills, it really only occurred in terms, especially in the marine environment, really over the last, you know, more like the last 40 or 50 years, and that's in part because we have switched over to an era of oil sometime around the mid-50s. Now, there's a nice study that was done a couple years ago about when the next oil spills occurred, and I want to really draw your attention to the panel in the top left, and that's from shipping accidents. And you can see that the number of spills from shipping accidents has dropped dramatically. The Exxon Valdez spill occurred in 1989. That's about the midpoint. Many things have occurred that have stopped and slowed down shipping accidents. Good nautical charts, GPS, even the capacity now to monitor shipping and the ships, all the ship's operations from another location so that they can be watched. The overall, and also that I think the oil industry recognized, especially after the Exxon Valdez, that oil spills are bad for business. And so there are other aspects of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, but the good thing is it's a really very good showing that shipping has certainly diminished. There are maybe some more concerns about pipelines. I'm not quite convinced that that data is strong, but certainly the Keystone Pipeline and others are on people's minds. So I gotta run, man. I'm talking too long. So what happens to oil when it gets spilled into the environment? Well, there's a lot of things that happens. It can get, and I'm going to try to talk about just 4 really quick processes. It can get evaporated, it can dissolve, it can get eaten by microbes, and get broken down by sunlight. And they all happen on different time scales, and certainly different compounds are affected differently by these processes. And this is what I study. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not a biologist, I'm a chemist, and I'm really intrigued about how nature, with all these different processes, and sometimes when humans get involved, change the chemical composition of the oil. And really what gets me super excited is what's the compound that can last the longest in the environment. If this was some type of reality TV show and there was a crude oil spill, I want to know who can last the longest. I find that absolutely fascinating, and I like to look at the structures of those molecules and say, what structure, if I could build them with a tinker tot, why is that compound so tough? How does that compound stymie nature? Of course, you can flip it on the other side and start to figure out about what compounds break down the easiest, and the ones that get kicked off the TV show in the first episode. This is another schematic about how oil gets released into the environment and the processes that are acted upon them. But I want to take home, this is a really key point. This is, if you can think about the oil that came out of the Macondo well, it traveled up 5,000 feet to the surface, and this is a sample of oil that I collected while the Deepwater Horizon disaster was occurring, about 2 kilometers or about a mile away. So this likely just surfaced on the bottom of the ocean floor and traveled maybe a mile, maybe not too far. The chemical composition of what came from the bottom of that well, from that video I just showed you, and what's on that slick, not that old, is very different, because the chemicals that are most likely to be affected about some certain weathering processes that occur very quickly change this oil. Collectively, that's called weathering. And weathering occurs on a molecular basis. And we can have, and I really only picked 4 examples, and I wish I had more time, but we can think about compounds that are evaporate, and often evaporation is considered a good thing. When the compounds get up into the atmosphere, they're either diluted or even broken down by some photochemical reactions in the atmosphere. You can dissolve some of the compounds. Some of the compounds get dissolved into the water. That's kind of a bittersweet, depends on the scale. When you dissolve, you put more water in the water that can potentially be toxic to the environment, but also if you have enough water, you can dilute it. You have microbes that can eat oil, but they're picky eaters, and they too also have a preference. And they also are based often on shape, and we're going to talk about that later. And then you have photochemistry, and that's that certain compounds can be broken down, they can get excited, and that excitement adds so much energy to the molecule, it gets shaken up so much that it breaks into pieces or changes. All these processes act on different molecules, on different times and timelines, and to a certain extent. So this is just an example of 4 compounds. These are all aromatic compounds: benzene, naphthalene, phenanthrene, and anthracene. And you can see that the structures on the right-hand side, and the vapor pressure, which is kind of an indicator of how much, oh boy, on the right-hand side, it should be the function of a compound's likelihood to evaporate. I made a mistake, but I want you to take home that benzene and phenanthrene, actually let's see, benzene and naphthalene, they only have 1 more extra ring in the naphthalene, but the vapor pressure is about, let's see, 1, to 3 times more greater. And so that means benzene is more likely to evaporate than naphthalene. I want you to draw your attention to phenanthrene and anthracene, the last two. They're isomers. They both have a molecular weight of 178. And they only differ about how that third ring is attached to each other. But that third ring changes its physical chemical properties so that phenanthrene is even more volatile or more likely to evaporate than anthracene. I'm going to try to make some comparisons to phenanthrene and anthracene in the next couple minutes to try to underscore to you that even isomers, that compounds that have the same amount of carbon atoms, but just put together with the Tinkertarts can change their fate. This is kind of one of these quick reference slides that gives you some insight about evaporation. And these are give you some idea on the time scale and the likelihood of loss from evaporation. You can see that gasoline has very volatile compounds like benzene in it, and it tends to evaporate rather quickly and to a full extent in the time scales of hours. You can have a heavier oil, like a heavy crude, and only maybe upwards of maybe 20% in a couple days can evaporate. So the key take home here is that the time it takes to evaporate differs and the extent differs. Compounds can dissolve based on what they call their aqueous solubility. Compounds that are more likely to dissolve are ones that can then be in the water column. Surprisingly, and not surprisingly, compounds that often have a likelihood to evaporate also have a likelihood to dissolve. And there's also sometimes of a battle maybe between a compound. It's sometimes even hard to predict when you don't see any, let's say, naphthalene in an oil. And we know that naphthalene has a likelihood to dissolve and evaporate. It's sometimes hard to disentangle what process made that naphthalene go away. Again, I'm just going to identify those 4 compounds. Again, the higher the aqueous solubility, the more likely a compound is going to dissolve. And again, I've compared my 2 friends, phenanthrene and anthracene, and phenanthrene's kind of in the mid-dissolution index, and anthracene's much lower. So again, not only do different molecules have different physical chemical properties that dictate their likelihood and their fate, but even just the way they're arranged changes. We're going to talk about microbial degradation. I kind of find it to be the most fun. And the way I think about microbes eating oil, it's like a Pac-Man going along eating. The difference is that in terms of, in this cartoon that I have here, I have all the, everybody getting eaten, it's about the same size, they only differ by color. But in reality, oil compounds have different shapes. And what I've shown is the structures in the top right-hand side of the compounds that are most likely to be eaten first and then later. And what you can see is if you were a Pac-Man, what would be the easiest, simplest compound to eat would be the first one on your far left, and that's a normal alkane. All the compounds are in a straight in a row. And then you can see that when you put branches or rings on them, or many, many branches, even branches and rings, to like the compound in your far right, they are less likely to be eaten. And so you can think about oil as a chemical buffet. And the normal alkanes, the one on the far left, that's your baked stuffed shrimp and your prime rib. And that's what the Pac-Man's going to eat first, and the microbes are going to eat first. And that compound on the far right, that structure might be, celery with some cream cheese smeared in it. That's a little old. And so, the idea that microbes are going to save the day is exciting. But they have a preference, and they sometimes stop. So I often tell people that microbes are like teenagers assigned a job or a chore, like let's say cleaning the garage. They can certainly clean the garage. They certainly have the capacity. You might tell them to do it on a Saturday because that would be the most convenient to you or maybe to the environment, but they may not do it till Sunday afternoon. They do it when they are done, when they feel like they're done, not when you think the job is done. And often microbes, like I just showed you earlier, will do the easiest or what's the most interesting and the most appetizing compounds first. And they leave the hard tasks behind you. And the end result is that as much as microbes are amazing, fascinating creatures just like teenagers, they can sometimes let you down. That's not to say that microbes are not unbelievably useful in oil spills, but they're hard, you know, and they're hard to predict, and they work on their own, they dance to their own drum. And so sometimes I hear people talk about how microbes are going to save an oil spill, and they play a role, but, you know, they have their place, and they have their limitations. And again, they only eat compounds that they want to eat, and it's often based on shape. This is just a figure put together by a scientist named John Volkman, who kind of gave you an idea is that when oil gets degraded by microbes, they actually have a very wide range, and you can actually have different scales of microbial degradation depending on what compounds we're eating. And so you can see that a level rank 1 is those compounds that I showed you earlier that were eaten first. And then I didn't even show you some of the structures that would be on a rank 9 or a rank 8 in terms of that Pac-Man. They'd be way far over. But they can do it. I've seen oils that are in the 9s, certainly the 8s, and but I've also seen crude oil spills that have only gone to a 1. Photochemistry, I'm going to try to tie up really quick right here. Photochemistry is, you know, compound. I'm just going to talk about direct photochemistry. Direct photochemistry is a compound absorbs light, gets excited, and breaks into pieces or gets chemically changed. For direct photolysis to occur, that compound has to have the capacity to absorb light, to get excited, and eventually break down. And so compounds like these 4 structures here have a capacity to absorb light, and then there's other reactions that occur. But I'm showing you 2 sets of isomers, benzanthracene and chrysene. They both weigh 228. They have the same amount of carbon atoms, same amount of hydrogen atoms. They're just hydrocarbons. And benz A and benz E pyrene also isomers. But when we were studying this Bouchard 120 oil spill, and we started to figure out how much they were photochemically broken down, we calculated the rate. That's how fast they broke down per day on the beach. And what we showed, just for example, for benzanthracene, its rate was 18 and chrysene was 9. So these 2 compounds, they're like fraternal twins, except one of them, benzanthracene, is about twice as likely to get broken down by sunlight than chrysene. Again, just showing you the fascinatingness about how just a slight difference in a molecule structure can dictate its fate. I'm just going to give me 2 more slides. These are 3 chromatograms. The top left is the Deepwater Horizon oil. The middle one is that sample I showed you of the oil that was collected a couple kilometers away. You can see that the oil is very different despite the fact that it's just a kilometer or 2 away after it got surfaced during the Deepwater Horizon. And on the far right is some Deepwater Horizon oil that I scraped from a rock in 2011 off Dolphin Island. These are all Deepwater Horizon oils, and you can see this progression of changing in the oils based on those processes that I just discussed earlier. I'm going to try to talk to you about these processes next. Probably the biggest process was evaporation. And I'm going to show you an example in this next slide. You can take some Deepwater Horizon Macondo well oil and put it on a hot plate. And if you let it evaporate so that about 50% of the mass of the oil evaporates away, that middle panel is Deepwater Horizon Macondo well oil that's been heated, so about 50% is gone. And then you can go and try to compare that to what, similar to a Macondo well field weather sample, that sample that I showed you in the previous slide. And it's amazing. Evaporation just takes away the smaller molecules. But what happened in the field, what we call field weathering, it did many, many different things and changed the oil. So the top left panel is what came out, and the bottom right is what you find a couple years later. And what has happened is that the compounds evaporated. Those compounds around this region, these circles kind of give you a general sense. There was likely some dilution of compounds that are willing to dissolve. We didn't really have that in our evaporation in the middle panel. Then the microbes ate, and they like those really straight little lines there because those molecules represent the ones that are the most easiest to eat, your prime rib or your baked stuffed shrimp. And then there was a little bit of photochemistry, and I try to give you some insight based on the size of these ovals and circles about their role. But the key thing here is that the oil that got released in the environment was acted upon at least by these 4 processes. These 4 processes acted on different compounds that were within the oil. And the key thing, too, is that the microbes started to eat, but some reason or another, they left behind that little hump, and they've kind of stalled. For whatever reason, the microbes have not completed. They still left behind that little pile. And I'm going to end right here. There's lots more we can study, and often we put together some of these cartoons that show the extent of weathering. This is from the Deepwater Horizon. The next slide is a figure that I put together with my colleague showing weathering, the extent of weathering by different molecules on different time scales from different oil spills. It just gives you an idea of the range. And I'm just going to end. I'm going to flip some slides. If you want to call and talk to me about fingerprinting, we can talk about it later. Too bad. Ran out of time. I talked too much. So I just want to summarize by saying that crude and distilled products differ in their chemical composition, that different compounds weather based on different processes. Every spill is different, most likely not another Deepwater Horizon. And like I say, I think about oil as a vast array of different personalities that go different places when given the opportunity. So I thank you for your attention, and I appreciate it. I got a lot of help from my colleagues and slides to put this talk together.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Now is the time to use the little chat box if you have any questions about the presentation or anything that you need a little maybe explanation about. Feel free to type them in, and I'll start asking our presenter to answer them for you. And if for some reason you can't hang around for the question and answer period, don't worry. We are recording this webinar, and we will get it up on the NOSB site as soon as possible tomorrow. It takes some time to download and upload and all that, but we will get it up there, and you can watch the Q&A session at the very end. Okay, any questions? I don't see any coming in yet. We'll take a minute to let everybody type in if they have any questions. Now, the first question came in that if what fractions of oil are in need of more research from an environmental impact point of view?
Oh, what a fantastic question. Well, you know, it's we don't know a lot about oil, and that's because oil is really complex. And so we know a lot about the impact of oil from the compounds that we can measure really well. So, for example, aromatic hydrocarbons are easy to analyze, and we can see them in the oil, but they usually make up a small fraction. And so it's funny, a lot of work has been studied on a small amount of the components in the oil. I would think that one of the more interesting ongoing efforts that is actually a result of support from the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative following the Deepwater Horizon was what we call the transformation product. So when I was telling you earlier that, for example, that benzanthracene was broken down by sunlight, it just didn't suddenly transform into carbon dioxide and water. It ended up being some type of intermediate, let's call it a metabolite. And what we're finding out from the Deepwater Horizon was that a lot of compounds were broken down, likely by sunlight, and continue to exist. And we have very little knowledge about how toxic they are. And so that's a big push right now, is trying to study oil compounds that are partially broken down and whether or not the partial breakdown products are as toxic as the native compounds present. I would say that certainly gets me excited to go to work.
Okay, another question was, given what you know about oil spills, what do you think about drilling in the fragile Arctic environment?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, you have to remember that I study oil spills, and, you know, I have no, well, let's just put it this way. When the Deepwater Horizon occurred, I had colleagues who were mad at BP and wouldn't get their gas pumped at BP and stuff like that. To me, the enemy, for lack of a better word, is the oil. And so and what I'm trying to say is I'm not very political or thinking about that at all. I think about oil as the enemy. And so we have to keep in mind that if we do drill and start to do a lot of activities in the oil and the Arctic, we have to start thinking about the challenges that we face with the risks that could occur. And I think the one thing that we have to keep in mind with the Arctic is that the infrastructure to respond to an Arctic spill is going to be much, much challenging. You know, there are some, and I would agree, that we were somewhat lucky with the Deepwater Horizon because the oil spill occurred 50 miles offshore off the Gulf of Mexico with multiple deepwater ports, with a strong highway system, with cell phone coverage, with the capacity to put many assets in theater very quickly. In the Arctic, we will not have that capacity to respond as quickly, and you'll have much less daylight and many other aspects. So the only thing I can think about and want to talk about from an Arctic oil spill is that the stakes are a lot higher if there is a disaster. It's going to be a much more challenging aspect. And so I think there's a certain level of concern, which I see by a lot of activities that have to be done. I think that's it.
Okay.
That question.
We didn't get any other questions, but someone did ask, since no questions are coming in, could you take the last, say, 10 minutes or so and go over your last slide?
Oh, yeah. How exciting.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like the coolest pictures. I'm so happy I got to do it. I thought you were going to come in and yank me off the stage. I wanted to show you this kind of fingerprinting idea of oil spills. And remember I told you earlier about biomarkers. Biomarkers are some of the skeleton remains of some of the compounds that were in the organic matter, the algae and other critters that were cooked and squeezed and partially transformed, but they still retain some of the genetic material of the oil. And what I want to show you here is I've been hemming and hawing about the bulk composition of the oil and how many different compounds are different, but they can be very, very small amounts of biomarkers in the oil. They're very trace. But these trace amounts of biomarkers can differ in different oils. So if you really wanted to take home and talk about how oils differ, we can talk about them by these remains, these molecular fossils that are in oil. So I'm going to show you some chromatograms. They're a little bit different than the ones I showed to you earlier. The other ones are what we call one-dimensional. These are two-dimensional. It's the same aspect, the same concept that you're basically seeing a map, and each one of these peaks represents a different molecule. So I'm going to kind of give you a slideshow, and I hope I don't make you kind of car sick or office sick from toggling too fast. But these are, this is the Deepwater Horizon oil. This is a region in a chromatogram that represents the compounds, these molecular fossils. And we've used kind of a shorthand notation to represent different compounds that are in the Macondo well oil. And for example, BNH is bis-norhopane, and capital H is hopane, and the G is gamacerane, and there's many compounds in there. But this is Deepwater Horizon oil. Okay, that is its. Let's think about it as its genetic fingerprint. And this is Exxon Valdez. Now hang in there with me. I can't resist the opportunity to toggle. You see any differences? How about that norhopane, NH? Look at the difference in norhopane and Exxon Valdez, right? See the NH, big peak in Exxon Valdez. Very smaller in Deepwater Horizon. I'm going to scroll to the next oil. This is crude oil off the Gulf of some of that oil that's off the Gulf of California. Again, you can see now that BNH, bis norhopane, is compare Exxon Valdez, both oils from the Pacific. Almost no bis norhopane in the Exxon Valdez cargo, but oil off the coast of Santa Barbara, very different. I can't resist the opportunity to talk about that little tiny peak with the O, about a little bit off the center to the bottom left. That's oleanane. Oleanane comes from compounds that are from flowering plants. When flowering plants only evolved about 50 million years ago, pardon me. When we see oleanane in a crude oil, we know that that oil had organic matter in it that's 50 million years or less. When we don't see oleanane, we can often say that that oil came from organic matter that was older. So not only can you get some kind of idea from its distribution, but it also kind of a little bit about what came in, the supply. Here's some crude oil that was collected from off the coast of Louisiana. Here, there you can see that O for oleanane, very nice. This is a natural oil seep off the Gulf of Mexico. So here's two Gulf of Mexico oils, different. This is an oil that's much lower, much south. And then here we are again with Deepwater Horizon crude. And then I want to show you the fidelity of the fingerprint. So here is our Deepwater Horizon crude oil that came off the bottom of the ocean floor, 5,000 feet below the surface. And here is its fingerprint when you find it about that 1 kilometer away. And you can see that there's no difference. The difference is really on how I graphically pasted this in. But the fingerprint's no different. It is unchanged. These compounds are incredibly environmentally tough. They are the toughest of the tough. They don't weather. Those 4 processes I talked about earlier. And here's this oil 1 mile away, and here's 50 miles away. And if you do the math, it hasn't changed at all. I'm going to end on one little note. We were doing some field work in the summer of 2011 in Louisiana and in Grand Isle. And some people on the beach dragged us to one spot and said, this is Deepwater Horizon oil. And they were pointing to these bricks that were in the lower panel of this picture. And they look much different than the residues of oil that we find along the Gulf of Mexico, like in the top panel, this one from Gulf Shores, Alabama. A lot of the oil that we find on the beaches now are these mixtures of sand and oil. We call them sand patties. Kind of have this characteristic orange hue, and they're about the size of a nickel or a penny. But we found these big bricks, and the people in this area were so passionate and so convinced that this oil in the lower panel was from the Deepwater Horizon that I took it. And I brought it back to the lab, and we actually were so interested in its shape, we actually CAT scanned it. We were doing all these things and trying to figure out what process would ever, from the Deepwater Horizon, make these bricks. And, you know, I'm thinking about how I'm going to win the Nobel Prize. You know, how could this have ever happened? And then finally, we got around from doing our due diligence and ran a fingerprint analysis on the oil. And this is what we found out. So this is the Macondo well oil in the top panel, and then a typical oiled sand patty like I showed you. It has a pretty similar fingerprint. And then that was that brick, that Elmer's Island is near Grand Isle that I showed you in the previous panel. A very different fingerprint. And so despite that, a lot of people thought on the beaches of the Gulf of Mexico that every oil and every black splotch on the beach came from the Deepwater Horizon. That's not true. And in fact, in this case, vastly chemically different. And it's a big take-home message that we have to remind, especially in areas where there's a lot of oil activity, there's a lot of natural oil seeps off the Gulf of Mexico. Every oil that you find in the Gulf of Mexico is not related to the Deepwater Horizon. In fact, now I would argue that the Deepwater Horizon is much less likely to be found than oil from natural seeps. So there I am. That's the section I skipped over.
Okay, great. One question came in while you were discussing that. They asked if oil spills can still be fingerprinted anywhere between 5 and 50 years after the incident.
Oh, what a great question. You know, conventional wisdom before the Deepwater Horizon would argue that in most cases, yes. In fact, we studied the Exxon Valdez spill, which occurred in 1989, and I just fingerprinted some oil from there and got a very nice match. What we're finding out from the Deepwater Horizon, that for some combination of weather and climate, that some of those really tough compounds, the compounds that I talked about winning the reality survivor show, are actually breaking down. In fact, compounds that we call steranes, which I would have thought would last decades, are breaking down very quickly from the Deepwater Horizon. Now, that may not be the case if this spill occurred in the Arctic, but the concept that these compounds retain the genetic fingerprint, these oils retain the genetic fingerprint, is not necessarily valid. And it's actually one of the more interesting aspects of the Deepwater Horizon, is that the rates of breakdown of these oils is much faster, and the capacity to attack and break down some of the toughest kids in the block has occurred. And so fingerprinting oils, for example, in the Deepwater Horizon, is becoming challenging. You have to really identify and just try to stick with the most toughest compounds and only use them to fingerprint. And some of the compounds that we would have thought were tough, we can't even use because they're not there. So yeah, I think fingerprinting is a lot harder than we used to think it was, because nature is beating up these oils and taking away some of the distinct uniqueness of a particular oil. That's a great question, and it's a big hot topic, by the way.
Okay, well, that was the last question that came in. So I think we're just about at our 5:30 mark, which was great. So
awesome.
We're going to end our presentation for today. I just want to remind everyone again that we are videotaping this, and so it'll be up on our website. Please share. This webinar series, the live part, is really for the NOSB coaches and other educators, but we do hope that you will share the recording with your students as you prepare them for the competition, or if you just teach this topic in any of your classrooms. Next week, on Wednesday the 21st at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to have Dr. Arthur Mariano present, and he's going to discuss ocean currents and the Deepwater Horizon oil blowout, specifically talking about transport of oil and the modeling used to track it. So we hope that you will be able to join us for that as well. We will send out a similar email and posting on social media with a similar link as today on how to join the WebEx meeting. And the last week of January, we're still determining the best date and time for it, but the last week of January we will have another presentation, and that'll be more on the ecological impacts of oil. Let's see. I think that's all I have to say. So on behalf of everyone, since I have you muted, I'm going to thank Chris for presenting this afternoon. Everybody's writing in that they really appreciated the presentation and thought it was wonderful, so thank you.
Oh, great.
As I said, I hope people will be able to join us for the next 2 webinars. And
this is Chris. If I can't guarantee that I'm going to respond because I'm not a great emailer, but if you have any questions, send me an email. I should be able to respond, or actually send them to Melissa so she can harass me if I forget.
Actually, yeah, I was going to suggest that at the end. If you have any questions about the webinar series, or if your students come up with a question while they're viewing it, the easiest thing to do is email nosb@oceanleadership.org, and I'll make sure that we contact Chris or I get you the answer about the series in general. Okay, so thanks again, everyone, for participating. I hope you have a good night, and thank you again, Chris.
Yep, my pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.